The modern seeker arrives at the threshold of esoteric wisdom with a peculiar affliction, the burden of an ego fortified by centuries of rationalist philosophy, consumer identity, and psychological defense mechanisms that were unknown to the ancient adepts. This seeker confronts a troubling paradox embedded within the alchemical tradition and Jungian depth psychology alike, that the very instrument through which one seeks transformation, the conscious ego, must itself undergo a systematic destruction before authentic spiritual evolution becomes possible. This is the doctrine of mortificatio, the alchemical putrefaction, the necessary death that precedes all genuine rebirth. The historical lineage of this concept winds through the dark laboratories of medieval alchemists, who understood that the negredo, the blackening phase of the great work, represented not merely a chemical operation, but a psychological ordeal of the highest magnitude. Paracelsus, the controversial Swiss physician-alchemist of the 16th century, insisted that true alchemy occurred primarily within the soul of the practitioner, stating that the outer work merely reflected the inner transformation. His radical assertion that the book of nature must be read with the feet meant that intellectual understanding alone could never unlock the mysteries. One had to walk the perilous path of self-dissolution. This understanding echoes through the Corpus Hermeticum, where Hermes Trismegistus declares that spiritual rebirth requires the casting off of the torments of matter, the illusions and attachments that constitute the false self. The Hermetic axiom, as above, so below, establishes that the macrocosmic process of universal transformation mirrors the microcosmic journey of individual soul work. Dennis William Hauck, in his exhaustive analysis, The Emerald Tablet, argues that mortificatio represents the critical juncture where the aspirant must abandon all pretense of control, surrendering to a process that the rational mind cannot direct or comprehend. Carl Jung, drawing upon this alchemical inheritance, recognized mortificatio as the psychological equivalent of ego death, a necessary confrontation with the shadow and the dissolution of persona structures that prevent integration with the self. For Jung, the alchemists were not deluded proto-chemists, but rather depth psychologists who encoded their understanding of transformation in symbolic language. The premise is uncompromising. The true secret is an internal psychological and spiritual endeavor that demands the systematic dismantling of everything the ego believes itself to be. The alchemical framework for mortificatio rests upon a sophisticated understanding of the three philosophical principles, sulfur, mercury, and salt, which constitute the ontological foundation of both matter and psyche. Sulfur represents the soul principle, the combustible essence of individual will and desire. Mercury embodies spirit, the volatile mediating force between matter and consciousness. Salt signifies body, the fixed principle of manifestation and crystallized form. Mortificatio specifically targets the false crystallizations of salt, the rigid ego structures and defensive patterns, while simultaneously volatilizing the mercurial element, creating the necessary instability for transformation. This triadic structure finds profound correspondence in the Kabbalistic tree of life, where the three pillars, severity, mercy, and equilibrium, describe the dynamic tension necessary for spiritual ascent. The path of mortificatio follows the left-hand pillar of severity, bina gebura hod, which represents contraction, judgment, and the harsh discriminations necessary to separate the pure from the impure. The seeker must descend through Darth, the abyss of unknowing, where all conceptual frameworks dissolve into formless potential. This descent into darkness mirrors the alchemical solve, the dissolution phase that precedes coagula, the reconstitution of a purified self. Neoplatonic philosophy, particularly as articulated by Plotinus and later synthesized by Renaissance Hermeticists like Marsilio Ficino, provides the metaphysical underpinning for this process. The soul, imprisoned in matter through a process of emanation and descent, must retrace its steps through a deliberate ascent. However, this ascent cannot occur while the soul remains identified with its lower vehicles, the physical body and the personality structures that constitute the empirical ego. Mortificatio enacts what Plotinus called the purification through negation, systematically stripping away false identifications until only the essential nature remains. The Rosicrucian tradition, as preserved in manifestos like the Fama Fraternitatis and the Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreutz, dramatizes mortificatio through the recurring motif of ritual death and descent into the tomb. The aspirant must die to the world before being reborn in spiritual illumination. This is not symbolic death as metaphor, but death as psychological reality, the authentic experience of ego-dissolution that generates existential terror precisely because it threatens the annihilation of everything the conscious mind identifies as self. The mentality required of the adept pursuing this work demands what Eliphas Levi termed the equilibrium of contraries, simultaneously holding unwavering will, the magical will, and radical receptivity to forces beyond conscious control. This paradoxical stance requires an occult ethics rooted not in conventional morality, but in alignment with cosmic law, what the Hermetic texts call acting in accordance with the divine nous. The adept must cultivate what Manly Palmer Hall described as philosophic doubt, a skeptical rigor that questions every consoling belief while maintaining absolute commitment to the transformative process itself. The disposition toward doubt serves as protection against the twin dangers of spiritual materialism and psychological inflation. The ego, confronted with numinous experiences during the alchemical work, will attempt to appropriate them, claiming spiritual advancement while merely reinforcing its own structures. True mortificatio dissolves this appropriating mechanism itself, creating what Jung called the transcendent function, a psychological capacity to hold the tension between conscious and unconscious without collapsing into identification with either pole. The alchemical opus proceeds through distinct phases, each corresponding to both material transformation and psychological metamorphosis. The first stage, calcinatio, involves the application of intense heat, metaphorically, the fire of consciousness directed toward the habitual patterns and defensive structures of the ego. In Jungian terms, this represents the initial confrontation with repressed material, the uncomfortable recognition that the persona we present to the world represents only a fraction of the total psyche. The adept must submit to the burning away of superficial identifications, career, social status, ideological commitments, recognizing them as temporary crystallizations rather than essential identity. This fire manifests psychologically as anxiety, restlessness, and the inability to find satisfaction in previously meaningful activities. The alchemists depicted calcinatio through images of bodies consumed by flames, bones reduced to white ash, a disturbing symbolism that accurately captures the felt sense of this phase. Jung observed that patients undergoing individuation often experienced spontaneous dreams of fire, burning houses or volcanic eruptions during periods of rapid psychological transformation. The ego, sensing its dissolution, generates defensive structures, rationalization, projection, spiritual bypassing, which must themselves be burned away through sustained self-examination. Following calcinatio comes solutio, the dissolution in water. If fire represents consciousness, water symbolizes the unconscious, the vast reservoir of forgotten memories, ancestral patterns, and archetypal energies that lie beneath the threshold of awareness. Solutio demands that the calcined ego surrender its hard-won boundaries, allowing itself to be flooded by unconscious contents. This phase generates profound disorientation as the familiar landmarks of identity wash away. Dreams become numinous and overwhelming. Synchronicities multiply. The normal boundaries between self and world become permeable. The danger of solutio lies in dissolution without reconstitution, what Jung termed psychotic dissolution, as opposed to therapeutic regression. The adept must maintain a thread of consciousness, even while surrendering to the flood, observing the dissolution without being utterly consumed by it. This requires what the alchemists called the Hermetic vessel, a psychological container strong enough to hold the overwhelming energies released during this phase. Without proper containment, solutio leads not to transformation, but to psychological fragmentation and regression into unconscious identification. Separatio follows as the necessary discrimination that rescues consciousness from the chaos of solutio. The alchemical texts depict this as cutting, dismemberment, or the separation of elements previously confused. Psychologically, separatio involves the difficult work of distinguishing authentic feeling from sentiment, genuine insight from fantasy, true intuition from wishful thinking. Jung emphasized that this discriminating function develops through sustained self-analysis, particularly through the method of active imagination, dialoguing with dream figures and inner personalities to understand their autonomous existence. This stage demands brutal honesty about one's actual motivations and the recognition that much of what the ego calls spiritual aspiration may be compensation for wounded narcissism or flight from authentic engagement with life. The adept must separate the gold from the dross, identifying which aspects of consciousness serve the individuation process and which merely reinforce neurotic patterns. This is the lesser mortificatio, where specific ego structures are surgically removed rather than dissolved wholesale. The true mortificio proper arrives as the fourth stage, the rotting, putrefaction and death of the remaining ego structures. The alchemical emblems depict corpses in coffins, skulls crowned with vegetation, bodies being devoured by crows, images of corruption and decay. This is the negredo in its most absolute form, the complete descent into the underworld where all light is extinguished. Psychologically, mortificatio corresponds to what John of the Cross described as the dark night of the soul, though the alchemical conception emphasizes active participation rather than passive suffering. During mortificatio, the adept experiences the death of meaning itself. Previous religious or philosophical frameworks that provided orientation collapse into incoherence. Relationships that once offered security reveal themselves as projections of inner dynamics. Creative work that once felt inspired becomes mechanical and empty. Most devastating is the recognition that the very seeking for transformation, the spiritual aspiration that initiated the entire process, is itself revealed as ego-driven and contaminated by unconscious motives. Nothing remains untouched by the corruption. Everything that the ego valued undergoes decomposition. Jung observed that patients in this phase often experience dreams of descending into basements, caves, or underworld realms populated by threatening figures. The shadow, all the disowned and repressed aspects of personality, emerges with overwhelming force. But mortificatio goes beyond mere shadow integration. It involves the death of the ego structure that opposed the shadow in the first place. The duality of conscious versus unconscious, good versus evil, higher versus lower self, all these oppositions collapse into undifferentiated prima materia, the chaotic first matter from which new form must be generated. The alchemical texts insist that this death must be complete and authentic, not simulated or prematurely transcended. The Hermetic maxim solve et coagula, dissolve and coagulate, indicates that reconstitution can only occur after total dissolution. Any premature attempt to rebuild identity creates what Jung called a mana personality, an inflated ego that appropriates transpersonal energies for narcissistic purposes. True mortificatio leaves the adept utterly defenseless, stripped of all pretense, facing the void without consolation or escape. Yet within this darkest phase, a mysterious transformation begins. The alchemists spoke of the peacock's tail, cauda pavonis, iridescent colors appearing in the blackness indicating that the work is progressing. Psychologically, this manifests as glimpses of a new organizing principle, what Jung termed the self, the archetype of wholeness that transcends, yet includes the ego. These glimpses arrive not as consolation, but as objective recognition that the death is not final, that a process larger than conscious intention is unfolding. Sublimatio emerges from the depths of mortificatio as the ascent of purified essence. The heaviness of salt transforms into the volatility of mercury. What was fixed becomes fluid, what was opaque becomes transparent. In psychological terms, sublimatio represents the spiritualization of libido, raw psychic energy refined into creative potency and spiritual insight. The contents that were drowned in solutio and killed in mortificatio now rise in purified form, freed from neurotic contamination and personal agenda. This ascending movement must not be confused with spiritual bypassing or premature transcendence. Authentic sublimatio occurs only after complete descent. It represents earned wisdom rather than wishful flight from embodiment. The adept who has undergone genuine mortificatio returns to the world transformed but not detached, spiritualized but not disembodied. Jung emphasized that the goal of individuation is not escape from the personality, but the realization of the complete self, which includes both consciousness and unconscious, spirit and matter, individual and collective. The final phase, conjunctio, represents the sacred marriage of opposites, the union of conscious and unconscious, male and female principles, spirit and matter, which generates the philosopher's stone. This is not synthesis that erases difference, but paradoxical union that preserves the integrity of both poles while transcending their opposition. The alchemical emblems depict the divine androgyne, the rebis, the two-natured being who has integrated all contradictions within a unified consciousness. The core ordeal of Mortificatio centers on what can only be described as ontological annihilation, the experiential conviction that the self is dissolving into absolute nothingness without guarantee of reconstitution. This is not metaphorical language or poetic exaggeration, but the phenomenological reality of a consciousness watching its own foundations crumble. The existential terror generated during this phase exceeds all other forms of psychological suffering because it strikes at the very root of existence itself, the certainty of I am. The alchemists knew this terror intimately, encoding it in images of dismemberment, consumption by monsters, descent into hell and burial alive. The Rosarium Philosophorum depicts the royal couple dead in the coffin, their bodies blackened and putrefying, a stark representation of the death that both practitioner and practice must undergo. This death involves the collapse of all mediating structures between consciousness and the raw encounter with being and nothingness. The conceptual frameworks that previously organized experience, religious beliefs, philosophical systems, psychological theories, reveal themselves as elaborate defense mechanisms against the abyss. Jung's patients undergoing individuation frequently reported dreams of earthquakes, collapsing buildings, tidal waves, and apocalyptic destruction during the mortification phase. These were not random nightmares, but accurate symbolic representations of the psyche's experience of its own transformation. The ego structure, which takes decades to construct and which represents the primary survival mechanism in the social world, must be systematically deconstructed. This generates authentic terror because, from the ego's perspective, its death equals the death of consciousness itself. The critical distinction between mortificatio and psychotic breakdown lies in the presence of what Jung called the observing ego, a thread of awareness that witnesses the dissolution without being utterly identified with it. In psychosis, the ego is overwhelmed and fragmented by unconscious contents, losing all capacity for reflection and reality testing. In mortificatio, the ego voluntarily submits to dissolution while maintaining a witnessing consciousness that recognizes the process as transformative rather than merely destructive. This requires extraordinary strength developed through years of preparatory work, meditation, self-analysis, dream work, and active imagination. The alchemical texts repeatedly emphasize that mortificatio cannot be rushed or circumvented. The Mutus Liber, the wordless alchemical book, depicts the adept sleeping while dew descends from heaven, indicating that this phase requires receptivity rather than active striving, patience rather than force. The modern practitioner must resist the compulsion to fix the depression, anxiety, or meaninglessness that characterizes this stage. Attempts to prematurely restore meaning through new belief systems, relationships, or projects merely abort the process, creating what Jung termed a provisional life, an existence that avoids the central confrontation with one's own depths. The teleological necessity of this suffering distinguishes mortificatio from clinical depression or existential neurosis. In pathological states, suffering is circular and repetitive, generating no transformation but only deeper entrenchment in neurotic patterns. The suffering of mortificatio, by contrast, possesses directionality and purpose. It burns away specific obstacles to individuation, while simultaneously generating the psychological space for the emergence of the self. This suffering is not arbitrary punishment, but the inevitable consequence of consciousness, attempting to expand beyond its current limitations. Philosophically, mortificatio enacts what Heidegger termed being toward death, sein zum Tode, the authentic acknowledgement of finitude and contingency that liberates consciousness from inauthentic modes of existence. The ego's strategies of distraction, busyness, and identification with social roles constitute what Heidegger called falling into the they-self, das Man. Mortificatio forces radical individuation by stripping away all external supports, compelling the adept to confront existence without mediation. Yet this confrontation reveals something unexpected, that beneath the terror of annihilation lies an indestructible ground of being, what the Upanishads call Atman and Jung termed the self. This ground cannot be reached through affirmation or construction, but only through the via negativa, the negative way of systematic negation. Every belief about who one is must be surrendered. Every consoling fantasy must be sacrificed. Every cherished identity must die. What remains after this complete stripping away is not nothing but rather the essential nature that exists prior to all ego constructions. The dark night of mortificatio thus serves as the gateway to authentic gnosis, not intellectual knowledge about spiritual truths, but the direct, unmediated encounter with the ground of being. The alchemists called this experientia lived experience that transforms the experiencer. No amount of reading, theoretical understanding, or spiritual practice can substitute for this ordeal. The seeker must walk through the fire, descend into the underworld, die the death. Only then does the stone reveal itself, not as something created, but as something that was always present, hidden beneath layers of false identification. The individual who emerges from the crucible of mortificatio bears little resemblance to the aspirant who initiated the work. This is not because fundamental nature has changed, but because consciousness has undergone radical deconditioning, shedding the accumulated layers of cultural programming, family complexes, and defensive structures that constituted the false self. What Jung termed the self, the archetype of wholeness and totality, now functions as the organizing center of personality rather than the fragile ego that previously occupied this position. The philosopher's stone, in its psychological manifestation, represents a stable state of consciousness characterized by several distinct qualities. First, there emerges what the alchemists called fixatio, a crystallized wisdom that remains constant through the fluctuations of external circumstance and internal mood. This is not rigidity, but rather the flexibility that comes from rootedness in essential being. The individual who has undergone mortificatio possesses an unshakable center precisely because that center has already been destroyed and reconstituted. Having died consciously, one no longer fears death. Second, the integrated self demonstrates what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold paradox and contradiction without collapsing into one-sided identification. Where the unintegrated ego must choose between competing values, suppressing one in favor of another, the individuated consciousness encompasses both poles in dynamic tension. The person can be both engaged and detached, compassionate and discerning, receptive and active, worldly and spiritual. This integration of opposites generates tremendous psychological energy and creative potency, which the alchemists symbolize through the union of king and queen, sun and moon, sulfur and mercury. Third, authentic individuation produces what might be called ethical spontaneity, action that flows naturally from essential being rather than from external moral codes or unconscious compulsion. This is what the Taoist tradition terms Wu Wei, effortless action aligned with the Tao. The individuated person responds appropriately to each situation without calculation, not because they have mastered ethical principles, but because their consciousness has become transparent to the archetypal patterns that govern existence. Manly Palmer Hall emphasized that true initiation produces not special powers, but rather the capacity to live in accordance with universal law. The responsibility that accompanies this transformation proves burdensome for many who achieve it. Jung noted that his analysans who completed the individuation process often felt isolated, unable to fully communicate their experience to those who remained identified with consensus reality. The individuated person perceives the suffering inherent in unconscious identification, yet cannot force others to awaken, can see solutions to collective problems, yet must watch humanity repeat destructive patterns, possesses wisdom that few seek and fewer still can receive. This isolation, however, differs fundamentally from the alienation of the unintegrated ego. Where neurotic alienation generates bitterness and resentment, the solitude of the individuated consciousness produces what the mystics called compassionate detachment. One serves the world not from compulsive need to fix or rescue, but from overflow of integrated being. The alchemical gold once achieved naturally radiates its light, transmuting base metals simply through proximity, not through force or proselytization, but through the quiet power of embodied wisdom. For the modern practitioner, integration involves bringing the fruits of the alchemical work into everyday existence. This is where many spiritual traditions falter, emphasizing transcendent experiences while neglecting the difficult task of embodying realization in relationship, work, and creative expression. The Hermetic axiom, as above, so below, reminds the adept that spiritual attainment must manifest in practical life. One does not achieve the stone in order to escape the world, but rather to engage the world from a place of integrated wholeness. The discipline and rigor emphasized by the Hermetic school serve as essential safeguards against the various forms of spiritual inflation and premature claims to realization that plague contemporary esotericism. The path of Mortificatio demands relentless honesty, sustained self-examination, and willingness to sacrifice every cherished identity. Without this rigor, the seeker merely accumulates spiritual concepts and peak experiences, while the fundamental structure of ego remains untouched. True transformation cannot be purchased, downloaded, or achieved through weekend workshops. It requires years of dedicated practice and the willingness to undergo authentic crisis. The individuated consciousness recognizes that the work is never complete, that each integration births new challenges requiring deeper surrender. The stone itself continues to evolve, becoming more refined, more potent, more transparent to the divine light that shines through all form. The adept becomes what the Rosicrucians called an invisible helper, one who serves the evolution of consciousness itself, working silently behind the scenes of history to midwife humanity's slow awakening. The alchemical laboratories with their athanors and alembics have long since crumbled to dust, but the great work continues in the hidden recesses of the psyche. Every human being stands before the furnace, whether they recognize it or not, deciding consciously or unconsciously whether to surrender to the transformative fire. Mortificatio offers no comfort to those seeking spiritual consolation, no easy answers for those demanding certainty, no bypass around the terror of ego death for those hoping to evolve without suffering. Yet for those few who possess the courage to descend into their own depths, who can endure the dark night without fleeing into distraction, who maintain the discipline to complete the work despite years of apparent failure and despair, for these rare individuals the promise of the alchemists proves true. The gold they discover surpasses all worldly treasures precisely because it cannot be lost, stolen, or corrupted. It is the gold of consciousness itself, purified through fire, dissolved in water, separated from dross, killed and resurrected, the indestructible diamond of awakened being. The contemporary seeker must understand that the secret teachings of the ages point always toward this interior work, this systematic transformation of consciousness through the death and rebirth of the self. No external practice, no ritual or ceremony, no master or tradition can substitute for the personal ordeal of mortificatio. The wisdom traditions can provide maps and guidance, but each individual must walk through the fire alone, must descend into their own underworld, must face their own shadow without the comfort of collective belief. The Hermetic school exists to preserve this rigorous path against the dilutions and corruptions of popular spirituality, to maintain the standard that demands everything from the aspirant because only total commitment yields total transformation. The work is severe, the path is narrow, the price is everything the ego holds dear. But for those who pay that price without reservation, who offer themselves completely to the alchemical fire, who die the death so that something greater might be born, for these, the philosopher's stone reveals itself not as legend, but as living reality. The gold you seek is not in the crucible, but in the will that kindles the flame, and in the surrender that allows that flame to consume everything you believe yourself to be.